Johnny Carson told us who the 9 wicked guests were during the Golden Age. For 30 years, Johnny Carson brought the biggest talents in America into people's homes. People felt like they were witnessing old friends catch up over coffee because of his warm smile and easy laugh. But Carson's smile typically faded after the cameras stopped running and the audience went home. People who knew him best say that America's favorite presenter had a mental roster of guests he thought were really bad people. A former Tonight Show producer who worked with Carson for more than 10 years said that Johnny was the best professional on camera. But as soon as we went to commercial, he would sometimes go over to Ed and say, "That person should never be near a camera or a child." In his last years, Carson was more open about the superstars he had secretly hated throughout his career. The anecdotes he told close friends portray a terrible picture of respected celebrities who were monsters behind the meticulously sculpted public images they put on. The most alarming thing Carson said was that one famous actress who looked nice and vulnerable on his couch had verbally attacked a young production assistant so badly that security had to step in. And the male star who Carson discovered doing something so horrible in his dressing room that he almost phoned the cops. These weren't just hard to get along with people or demanding stars. Carson says that these folks were very bad people who hid behind their popularity and talent. People in the industry supported predators, abusers, and manipulators for decades. But first, we need to know why the first name on Carson's list made him the most angry and why no one has ever talked about the private fight backstage until now. First of all, I'm starstruck, and I think they all know it. Second, I look for a movie that people can relate to. Joan Crawford was the queen of Hollywood and had ice in her veins. People who had adored Joan Crawford for decades saw her on The Tonight Show in 1970. She was still the polite Hollywood star they had always known. Crawford was the epitome of old Hollywood elegance with her faultless posture, flawless looks, and trained charm. But some staff members of The Tonight Show said that Crawford acted completely differently when the cameras weren't rolling. Carson is said to have told his biographer years later, "She was one of the coldest people I've ever interviewed. It's like talking to a pretty statue that has nothing inside." Before Crawford even got to the studio, her looks were already causing problems. She asked for very particular lighting needs, so much so that the technical director of the production still had the 4-page document in his archives decades later. A former producer said that everything had to be perfect. The angle of her chair, the height of Johnny's desk, and even the temperature of the studio, which had to be exactly 67 degrees and not 66 degrees or 68 degrees. Crawford finally showed up 3 hours before the taping with her own makeup crew. Even though the show had award-winning makeup artists on staff, what really showed Crawford's character was how she treated people differently depending on how important they were. A stagehand who was there that day recalled, "She almost curtsied to Johnny." But when a young production assistant accidentally entered her dressing room with water she had requested, Crawford exploded. According to many witnesses, Crawford launched into a rant so savage that staff workers in the hallway froze in disbelief. She reportedly told the assistant, a 20-year-old woman who was just starting out in the business, that she was a brainless little ... and told her to look for employment at a brothel where being bad at things might be helpful. The young woman ran away crying, and Crawford told her to fire her. Carson's producer said no, which made things tense during the whole session. But the most distressing thing about Crawford's look wasn't simply how she treated her people. It was the manner she planned to change as soon as the cameras switched on. One producer said she acted like a computer that was attempting to be a lady. She had practiced every answer, every chuckle, and every time that came up. There was nothing real. As the commercials were on, Crawford would stop smiling and sit in silence, without talking to anyone. But as the red light came back on, she would come back to life. Carson was good at making guests feel at ease, but he had a hard time connecting with Crawford. He is said to have told Ed McMahon after the show, "I've interviewed corpses with more personality." Years later, Christina Crawford's biography, Mommy Dearest, came out and said that Joan abused her adopted children. Carson wasn't shocked. Close colleagues say he only nodded and said, "I saw who she really was in those few hours. I believe every word." But if Crawford's cold calculation made Carson nervous, his next enemy was even worse. Power that is raw is utilized to scare and threaten. I can answer that by saying that at those lovely moments, I play Daphne and Chloe or Frank Sinatra, the charming bully Carson couldn't stand. Frank Sinatra and Johnny Carson seemed to have a nice relationship on film. The famous singer would speak jokes, stories, and sometimes sing, while Carson acted like a good host. But behind the scenes, Carson was said to really not like Sinatra. Carson didn't like Blue Eyes because of how he treated people when he believed no one important was looking. According to some biographies, Carson allegedly told a buddy that if he didn't sing, he would be a mob enforcer. There are times when I think he was both. Crew members knew that Sinatra's performances on The Tonight Show caused a lot of stress. Longtime staff members say that Sinatra would come with a group of up to 8 men who were not show business types and were more like folks you wouldn't want to encounter in an alley. These individuals would walk around the studio, observing the personnel and making it feel like they were being watched, as one cameraman put it. But what really bothered Carson was seeing how Sinatra handled individuals he thought were underneath him. In the early 1970s, a floor manager made the mistake of giving Sinatra the usual 3-minute warning before his part. Several others saw Sinatra grab the man by the tie and draw him close. He then said, "Nobody tells me when I've got 3 minutes. I'll go on when I'm ready." The floor manager, who was in his 50s and a veteran of the Korean War, was clearly shaken afterward. Carson almost called off the program when he spotted this on his office monitor. The producer's reminder of how well Sinatra would do in the ratings was the only thing that made him keep going. Sinatra's reliability, or lack of it, was another cause of stress. He is said to have cancelled appearances at the last minute more than once, even once just 2 hours before filming when he was already in the building but decided he wasn't in the mood. During a commercial break, Sinatra said something unpleasant about the looks of a female staff member that was loud enough for those nearby to hear. This was the most revealing moment. Carson, who usually kept his professional distance, coldly said, "We don't talk about my staff that way here." The atmosphere was thick, and Sinatra was clearly shocked that anyone, even Johnny Carson, would stand up to him. When the cameras came back on, both men kept up their professional appearances, but crew members saw that Carson's queries got shorter and less interested. Carson reportedly instructed his producer after that visit, "I don't care what his ratings are. Limit him to once a year maximum." This is especially important because Carson rarely got involved in booking selections and almost never blacklisted guests outright. It said a lot about how much he didn't like Sinatra's behavior that he limited the singer's appearances. Sinatra was the bully side of celebrity power, and Carson's next guest was a different type of difficult, an ego that had no limits or constraints. The world is full, so you might not agree with what I'm saying. All of the best young filmmakers are wet. Orson Welles was a genius who thought rules didn't apply to him. During the Carson era, Orson Welles was a guest on The Tonight Show many times. His booming voice, larger-than-life appearance, and amazing stories from his long career always made for great television. People at home saw a nice and smart racer. Carson and his team saw something different. A man whose ego had grown so big that he thought the standard norms of television didn't apply to him. "Never again," Carson is believed to have said after one very hard Welles appearance. "That guy thinks he's still running Rome." The problems usually started before Welles even got to the studio. Writers for The Tonight Show said that Welles often ignored any questions or topics Carson's team had come up with. "He told us our questions were pedestrian and obvious," one former writer said. "He really crossed them all out and gave them back an empty page." Carson had to interview one of the most important people in the history of movies without any preparation or structure, which made him uncomfortable. A specific problem since Welles often told long, winding stories that were hard to cut down for time. Welles was supposed to be on for 7 minutes at one visit in the middle of the 1970s. He lingered on the couch for about 25 minutes, even though Carson gave him several hints that it was time to leave. A director said that Johnny would give guests a series of indications when time was running out. Welles spotted them all and kept chatting. "We had to completely bump 2 other visitors." Welles was just as rude to the personnel as he was to the customers. It's been said that he wouldn't talk to production helpers directly, instead, he would talk to them in the third person, even when they were right next to him. "Tell the girl I need more water or tell the boy to change the light." People who knew Carson well said that what really bothered him about Wells was that he treated The Tonight Show like it was his own show instead of Carson's. Orson would bring things to use as props, alter the subject without warning, and even try to control camera shots from his seat. A former producer said, "He once really stood up and tried to tell our camera operators which angles to use." Johnny was furious. After one very difficult appearance, Carson reportedly told Ed McMahon, "Genius doesn't excuse everything. Being smart doesn't give you the right to take over someone else's show." Carson, who was also a perfectionist when it came to making TV shows, found it extremely annoying that Wells didn't care about the limits of the medium. Even while he publicly respected Wells's huge accomplishments to film, he started to see him as a warning about what happened when ego gets in the way of talent. Wells was hard to deal with because of his big personality, but Carson's next hard visitor offered a whole other set of problems. Unexpected behavior that could swiftly turn aggressive spelled out in light bulbs. I mean, besides something called a temperament, which is mostly Bette Davis, the queen of verbal aggression in Hollywood. When Bette Davis was on The Tonight Show, she was at her most interesting. She told funny stories in her own voice, looked great even in her later years, and talked about interesting Hollywood history. They didn't notice the times before and after the red light flashed on when Davis supposedly showed his true self. Be so rude that even Carson, who is usually calm, was shocked. Carson is said to have informed Ed McMahon after one really bad showing, "She doesn't need a stage, she needs a courtroom." According to some staff members of The Tonight Show, Davis's first transgression was how she treated other guests. No one should have to be cross-examined by Bette Davis without a lawyer present. Davis would regularly interrupt or talk over other celebrities when they were on the same broadcast, especially if they were younger or female. She would literally turn her back on other guests on the couch. A former talent coordinator said, if someone else was telling a story that got laughs, you could see her seething, planning how to regain control. Behind the scenes, Davis's behavior was even worse. She is said to have asked for whiskey in her dressing room before shows. Guests of her time often drank too much, which sometimes made her say and do things that were not suitable. Female staff members who worked on the show in the 1970s said that Davis often used sexist and racial language that was shocking even at that time. One makeup artist said that Davis turned her down and asked for someone whose hands don't shake like they're coming off a 3-day drunk. Carson usually stayed out of fights, but she made an exception for Davis when she started yelling at a cue card holder for being too slow during a rehearsal. Johnny actually stepped in and remembered a production assistant who saw what happened. He spoke to her very softly, "Miss Davis, on this show we talk to everyone with respect or we don't talk at all." She was shocked, possibly because she wasn't used to being challenged, but she backed down. Carson found Davis especially hard to deal with because of how she treated other people, even though she was clearly very talented. Some difficult visitors may be written off as talentless, but Davis was a real legend whose work Carson loved. After her last appearance on the show in the early 1980s, Carson supposedly told his producer, "That's the last time. Life's too short to spend it being verbally flogged by Bette Davis, no matter how many Oscars she has." While Davis at least directed her insults at adults who could defend themselves, Carson's next problematic guest brought a different kind of discomfort behavior toward young women that crossed professional boundaries. Some, too. Yes, of course. I'll make you tall and muscular. Mickey Rooney, the old child star with hands that wander. Mickey Rooney was a Hollywood celebrity, the #1 box office star from 1939 to 1941, and a living link to the industry's golden period. His performances on The Tonight Show should have been happy memories of a long and successful career. Instead, many staff members say that Rooney's trips were known for his bad behavior, frenetic energy, and sometimes being drunk. Carson informed his producer after one especially bad appearance in the mid-1970s that he thought being short gave him the right to be a pervert. At the time, Rooney was in his mid-50s and was known among female staff members for touching them inappropriately, making provocative comments, and crossing professional lines. Several sources say that young production helpers would seek to be moved when they found out Rooney was booked. A former assistant who worked on the show in the late 1970s said that when you handed him water, he would grasp your hand, try to draw you closer, and ask if you were married. He would hang on to your wrist for just a bit too long if you tried to escape. What worried us even more was that Rooney didn't seem to know when he had too much to drink. Employees of The Tonight Show said that he seemed drunk on at least 3 different occasions, slurring his words and forgetting what he was talking about in the middle of a sentence. In 1977, Rooney started recounting a story about Judy Garland that quickly got improper, so Carson had to cut him off and change the subject. During the commercial break, Carson allegedly asked his producer, "Is he drunk or is this just who he is now?" Carson found Rooney especially hard to deal with because they were from different generations and had different ideas about what was acceptable behavior. Rooney was born in 1920, which was a time in Hollywood when certain behaviors toward women were normal, if not allowed. Johnny wasn't a prude, but he had clear rules about how to act at work, said a director who worked on the show for many years. When others called him out on his behavior, Rooney looked genuinely perplexed, as if he didn't understand why it was a problem. After Rooney made several comments about a young actress who was also on that night's show, Carson did something rare and apologized to her in person after the recording. The filmmaker said, "I've never seen Johnny so upset by how a guest acted. That's not how professionals act on my show, and it won't happen again," he warned her. He kept his promise, and Rooney's visits became less frequent in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Carson reportedly insisted on midday pre-tapings instead of live nighttime broadcasts when Rooney was booked. Rooney's actions made things awkward, but Carson's next problematic guest brought a whole new set of problems. The staff talked about how unreasonable and demanding they were all the time. "I don't think my last marriage lasted a day, and I didn't think it would last that long." Zsa Zsa, the diva who made Carson feel hopeless. Zsa Zsa was a Tonight Show favorite who appeared dozens of times while Carson was on the air. She was beautiful, had a unique accent, and was flirty. Viewers observed a charismatic, larger-than-life person who made fun of her Hungarian origins and several marriages to get laughs. According to many crew members, Gabber was one of the most demanding and difficult guests in the show's history. "I'd rather interview a cat," Carson reportedly quipped after a particularly exhausting Gabber appearance. At least the cat wouldn't need 3 assistants and special lighting. Gabber's demands began long before she arrived at the studio. According to former Tonight Show employees, her standard requirements included a specific temperature in her dressing room, 74 degrees, fresh flowers, orchids only, no carnations, a bottle of Perrier water with exactly 3 ice cubes. Her own lighting technician flown in at the show's expense. No female guests who were younger than 40 booked on the same episode. Her writer read like a parody of celebrity demands, recalled a former talent coordinator. "We thought it was a joke the first time we got it." When these requirements weren't met exact, Gabber reportedly would refuse to leave her dressing room until the situation was rectified, often delaying taping and throwing off the entire show's schedule. One of the most infamous incidents occurred when Gabber arrived for a taping and discovered the makeup department didn't have her preferred brand of foundation. According to multiple witnesses, she got into a shouting match with the head makeup artist, demanding someone be sent to Beverly Hills immediately to purchase the correct product. Johnny actually had to intervene. A former producer remembered. He called her directly and said something like, "Zsa, honey, you look beautiful already and we have a show to do. Let's save the cosmetics emergency for another day." What particularly irked Carson about Gabber's behavior was how it affected the overall production. Other guests would be kept waiting, crew members would have to work overtime, and the show's carefully planned schedule would be thrown into chaos. After one appearance where Gabber arrived 40 minutes late and then complained about her introduction, Carson reportedly told his executive producer, "Next time she wants to be on, tell her we've renamed the show The Tonight Show, starring Zsa Zsa Gabber, and I'll be happy to be her sidekick." Despite these frustrations, Gabber continued to appear on the show throughout Carson's tenure, a testament to her undeniable entertainment value when the cameras were actually rolling. While Gabber's diva demands created logistical headaches, Carson's next challenging guest brought a different kind of discomfort. Unpredictable behavior that could quickly turn a lighthearted interview into an uncomfortable confrontation. Cow, the obnoxious mama. Shelley Winters, the unpredictable powder keg. Shelley Winters was a 2-time Oscar winner with a career spanning decades. From glamorous roles in her youth to character parts in her later years. On paper, she should have been an ideal Tonight Show guest. Experienced, accomplished, and full of Hollywood stories. In reality, according to those who worked on the show, Winters was one of Carson's most unpredictable and volatile guests. "Shell doesn't talk, she detonates," Carson reportedly said after one particularly explosive appearance. Winters became infamous among the show's staff for her inability or unwillingness to adapt to the light, entertainment-focused format of late-night television. Instead of telling funny stories or talking about her current work, she would often start talking about really personal or political issues that made Carson very uncomfortable. In the middle of the 1970s, Winters went on a 5-minute rant on government corruption after Carson asked him a simple question about a recent movie. Carson had a hard time finding a way to switch to a commercial in a lighthearted way. Johnny was quite good at steering discussions. But with Shelley, it was like attempting to steer a storm, said a former director. Once she started, there was nothing he could do but wait for her to run out of energy. Winters' unpredictability went beyond the things she talked about. She also became infamous for her aggressive outbursts. She flung a glass of whiskey in the face of fellow guest Oliver Reed on a British talk program when he made sexist comments. This is one of the most well-known things she did. Because of her reputation for being unpredictable, the workers of the program were always on edge when she was booked. A former stage manager said, "We would actually take some things off the set when we knew she was coming. Anything that could be thrown or knocked over would mysteriously disappear before her segments." Despite these problems, what set Winters apart from some of Carson's other difficult guests was that her behavior seemed to come from real passion rather than malice or ego. She cared a lot about social and political issues and thought that every time she went out in public was a chance to talk about them, no matter where she was. Carson seemed uncomfortable during Winters' most intense times, yet she still respected how real Winter was. Carson reportedly told his producer after one particularly fiery appearance in which she spoke out against the Vietnam War, "I may not want a vacation with her, but at least she means every word she says." However, Winters' appearances became less frequent in the later years of Carson's tenure, as the host preferred guests whose conversational style complemented rather than challenged the show's format. Winters' impassioned unpredictability made things hard on the air, but Carson's next challenging guest was someone he personally considered unpleasant. Extreme political ideals that hurt weak groups of people. "I prefer puzzles with large muscles and a crimson center. I loved Jane Russell, a gorgeous actress whose politics Carson couldn't stand." In the 1940s and 1950s, Jane Russell was one of the most famous sex symbols in Hollywood. She is known for movies like The Outlaw and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. She was a logical choice to be a regular guest on The Tonight Show because of her stunning looks and important role in film history. Russell didn't go back to Carson's couch very much after a few times in the early 1970s. According to show insiders, this was because Carson didn't like Russell's increasingly strong political views and how she treated LGBTQ+ staff members. Carson was a moderate Republican for most of his life, but he made sure that The Tonight Show stayed mostly impartial on political subjects that could cause problems. Russell, on the other hand, apparently utilized backstage conversations to share extreme conservative beliefs that Carson found uncomfortable. A former producer said, "Johnny could handle guests with different political views. What bothered him was when those opinions turned into personal attacks on staff members or other guests." According to several accounts, Russell became notorious for making disparaging comments about LGBTQ+ individuals working on the show. During one appearance in the early 1970s, she allegedly refused to allow a gay makeup artist to touch her face, demanding a replacement. Even more concerning to Carson was a reported incident involving Rock Hudson. According to a talent coordinator who worked on the show, Russell refused to be booked on the same episode as Hudson, making derogatory comments about his sexuality, which, though not publicly acknowledged at the time, was known within Hollywood circles. Johnny had many friends in the gay community, including several staff members. The talent coordinator recalled, "He was ahead of his time in not tolerating that kind of discrimination on his show." Carson's final breaking point with Russell allegedly came during a 1973 appearance when she made dismissive comments about civil rights legislation during a commercial break, though not picked up on broadcast microphones. Her remarks were overheard by several crew members and reportedly reached Carson's ears. After that appearance, Russell was noticeably absent from The Tonight Show's guest roster for the remainder of Carson's tenure. One of the few clear cases where Carson appears to have personally vetoed future bookings. What made this situation particularly notable was Carson's general reluctance to ban guests outright, especially those with Russell's level of star power and historical significance to Hollywood. For him to take such a definitive stance spoke volumes about how strongly he objected to her behavior. While Russell's politics and treatment of staff created a permanent rift with Carson, his final and perhaps most intense dislike was reserved for a comedian whose public persona and private behavior were reportedly worlds apart. I've never asked you this, but I'm asking you now simply, purely. Jerry Lewis, the comedian Carson called truly hateful. Jerry Lewis was one of America's most successful entertainers. A groundbreaking comedian, actor, director, and humanitarian known for his annual telethons benefiting muscular dystrophy research. His manic energy and physical comedy had made him a global star. Behind the scenes, according to numerous Tonight Show staff accounts, Lewis was also one of the most difficult, demeaning celebrities in Hollywood, a reputation that earned him a special place on Carson's personal blacklist. He's what happens when ego outruns talent, Carson reportedly told a colleague after a particularly troublesome Lewis appearance in the mid-1970s. Some problematic guests only acted badly around subordinates, but Lewis was said to have no problem showing how much he hated Carson. Lewis shouted over Carson, took questions meant for other guests, and even leaned over and changed Carson's tie without permission during one of his most memorable appearances. This made the normally calm host very angry. Johnny didn't like it when others touched him without asking. A previous producer said, "It was a well-known rule, you don't touch Johnny unless he starts it." Lewis understood this and did it anyway to show his dominance. People say that Lewis was even harsher with his crew. Several people say that he wouldn't learn the names of his staff and instead called them "hey, you" or by their job title, like camera guy or makeup girl, no matter how experienced or senior they were. One very disturbing incident happened when a camera operator reportedly coughed quietly during Lewis's rehearsal. Several people who saw it said that Lewis stopped everything and started yelling that the cameraman was a professional who breathed like an amateur and that he should be kicked out of the studio. A floor manager who was there said that Jerry yelled at a camera operator for breathing too loudly. Not talking, just breathing. The poor guy had allergies. Carson didn't like that Lewis acted like a devoted champion for children in public but treated those who couldn't help his career badly in private. A producer who worked closely with Carson said that the Jekyll and Hyde routine made Johnny's skin crawl. He had seen Jerry cry on his telethon about how much he loved kids, and then he came to our show and treated people like they were less than human. After Lewis's last appearance on The Tonight Show in the early 1980s, Carson reportedly told his executive producer, "Never again." Carson didn't often ban guests outright, but Lewis was one of the few celebrities who were effectively blacklisted from the show during its last decade. Years later, at a private dinner, Carson is believed to have said something about Lewis that surprised everyone there since it was so severe. He is truly hateful in a place full of fakes, and that takes a lot of work. What Carson's blacklist shows about how Hollywood really is. Johnny Carson's own thoughts on these 9 tough guests. Joan Crawford, Frank Sinatra, Orson Welles, Betty Davis, Mickey Rooney, Zsa Zsa Gabor, Shelley Winters, Jane Russell, and Jerry Lewis give us a rare, unvarnished look at what life is really like in Hollywood beneath the carefully crafted image of